So my name is Harriet O'Neill, as I said, and I'm Assistant Director for Humanities and Social Sciences here at the BSR. And it is my great pleasure to have another virtual BSR lecture. And our speaker tonight is Clare Hornsby, who many of you will know. And she has said that we can read her detailed biography on the web page. So I'm sure many of you would have read that. So it just leaves me to say that she has been she's an art and architectural historian, but she's been the most wonderful research fellow here at the BSR. And I'm very grateful to have had her support and help and had the opportunity to work with her on amazing conferences such as the Albani conference and the forthcoming Piranesi 300 conference, which will hopefully be at the end of January. So yes, thank you to Clare for being such a wonderful support and contribution to making so many valuable contributions to the BSR. I want to say that I am going to remain here as a face, but I'm going to put myself on mute. And you can ask any questions or make any points through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I think I will hand over to Clare for her paper tonight, which is William Dugood and William Kent, A Story of Politics, Freemasonry and Art Deals in 18th Century Rome. So thank you very much, Clare. I'll let you share your screen and mute myself.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, that's cool. And I'm just going to like disappear myself because it's less confusing.
Yeah, and if you, I think if you put your slides on, we won't see your backdrop.
Yeah, I'll press play.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, great.
How's that? Is that good?
Lovely, brilliant. So I'll mute myself and I'll let you begin, Clare.
Okay, thanks. Good evening. The origin of this piece of research is my work on Cardinal Alessandro Albani, tracing his involvement in promoting the market for art and antiquities exported from Rome to Hanoverian Britain, and arising from the conference we did that Harriet mentioned last December at BSR. What this talk wants to achieve is to use one event, the commission of the painting of a ceiling in a Roman church, which we see here, to trace the networks, both prior and subsequent, around the commission, to stitch together some of the information already revealed by scholars on William Dugood, and to take this further, which I started to do in my trips to the archive of San Giuliano dei Fiamminghi in January and February of this year, for which facility I warmly thank Father Hugo van Eerman. I was able to trace more information on Dugood's connection with the church than had been found in the past, including 1 or 2 documents drafted in Lisbon at the end of Dugood's life, which almost, but not quite, provide the smoking gun to connect him with the Albani family in Rome around 1714. I hope to pick up this research when libraries and archives are again accessible. The connection in Rome of Dugood and Kent in the teens of the 18th century is a glance into the dense networks that flourished there, revealing that the barriers, as we might define them, between Catholic and Protestant, Jacobite and Hanoverian, artist, dealer and collector, antiquarian, artisan, did not exist, or insofar as they did, they were labels rather than barriers. I should like to thank the BSR in the person of Harriet O'Neill for helping me to get this talk into the public domain, and acknowledge the work of 2 scholars who have broken ground on Dugood in chronological order: Fabio Barri with his archival work centered on San Giuliano, published in 1998, and David Connell, former curator director at Burton Constable Hall in Yorkshire, who published in 2009 and 10 articles about Dugood that present evidence from the National Archives and elsewhere, with details of the collection of gem casts made by Dugood in Parma in the 1730s. I must mention help I received this summer from Angela Della Force in navigating the complexity and particular difficulty of the Portuguese 18th century, and also recently from Dr. Caroline Barron, who gives very good advice. As always in scholarship, we owe debts to those who have ventured before us. The protagonists of this story did not have a long connection and were very different people. One, Kent, was Protestant, arriving in Rome under the patronage of a wealthy Yorkshire gentleman, Massingberd, and I will be showing quotations from his letters. Kent was very much on the make in those years. We meet him as a young man and as a draftsman and student painter in the workshop of Giuseppe Bartolomeo Chiari, as a dealer entrepreneur, and an eager visitor to the sights of Italy, accompanying his noble patrons. William Kent, from humble beginnings in Bridlington, Yorkshire, became a lucky man. During his 10 years in Italy, he was learning to paint, acquiring taste and knowledge, and then went on to fame and to fortune as an architect and garden designer in England, with commissions from Thomas Cook at Holkham in Norfolk, which we see here, magnificent structure, from Lord Burlington at Chiswick House, but also from the government and from the king. At the bottom right, we see Rousham, the beautiful garden in Oxfordshire. Our other protagonist, Dugood, had none of these advantages, and we will look at his origins in a moment. But in a similar way to Kent, he used his Roman period to network, to make money through art, in his case as a jeweler, and to serve the wealthy as a facilitator of deals. Let's look at the political and historical background into which both Kent and Dugood entered Rome. Here are the two sides of Clement XI Albani: politics and diplomacy, and the arts. Clement's political woes were caused by the pan-European War of Spanish Succession, its impact on the Papal States and on his sphere of influence via the series of complex alliances and negotiations which took place as it came to a close. His nephew Alessandro Albani was heavily involved with these political matters. Meanwhile, Clement's credentials as enlightened pope are impeccable, not only in his commission of sensitive restoration architecture of ancient churches such as San Clemente, but his collecting. Here we see him admiring the famous Cassiano dal Pozzo drawings, which were then acquired by his nephew Alessandro and are now in the royal collection in England. Kent, his arrival in Rome, and events leading up to his association with Dugood are linked with the man in the centre of his painting, in the pink coat, John Talman, who was a Catholic, son of William Talman, an architect. In 1707, John had assisted at the founding of what was to become the Society of Antiquaries of London, and his early journey to Rome with Kent to collect and make extensive drawings had a notable impact on antiquarian scholarship in Britain. His letters to his father are fundamental evidence in our knowledge of the arts and society in Clementine Rome. We first hear about Kent's activities as a participant in the market with the arrival of the nobleman Thomas Cook, who was very young when he first came to Italy and spent a few years being educated at the Turin Academy before commencing his tour to the major centres of the arts. Here we see him on the left, a few years into his stay, as depicted by the most famous portraitist of the time, Francesco Trevisani. In the image on the right, we can just about see two little figures dwarfed by the vast interior of the Gesù. These are the young man and his tutor, Dr. Hobart, who was a scholar and medical doctor, fellow at Cambridge, who had joined the household in 1712 after his return from another tour to Rome with another young grand tourist, Lord Cornbury. At that time, Hobart had met and had dealings with both Talman and Kent. Now, with Cook, Hobart refreshed those Roman relationships and gathered a staff of teachers around Cook to continue his cultural education. The keys to a successful tour were the networks of people available at each destination, and if they could be expatriates also, this made things much easier. This was a particular moment in the history of the market for the arts in Rome, when the lower level, so to speak, players could be artists and collectors and facilitated commissions, as we will see at San Giuliano. Intermediaries such as these, and there were many, and most of them, of course, were Italian, were crucial. Let's take a glance at some of the works that Cook commissioned in Rome. Here are three images of paintings from a series of 6, all now at Holkham. They all have subjects connected with Republican Roman ideals, appropriate for a nobleman being brought up with the memory of the so-called Glorious Revolution by his grandfather and his cousin, Sir Edward Coke. No doubt Hobart would have chosen the subjects in consultation with his patron, with his employer, and with the artists. The placing of the patron of Coke in each of these paintings, it has its obvious metaphorical meaning. A quote from one of Kent's letters there on the right. Turning now to Dugood, we have much less information, but I have summarized some of the things we know on the right. It is indicative of the position he held in Rome and elsewhere in these years that the comment here on his character was made by the notorious Baron Philip von Stosch in one of his spy reports to the British government. Dugood, Ducat, a man of intrigue and ability. Stosch was primarily an antiquarian, a dealer and connoisseur of gems, an important friend of Cardinal Alessandro Albani from 1715 when he had arrived in Rome. Dugood's marginal status, no doubt, was the means by which he was able to act most effectively, and, as we will see, with some remarkable results. For evidence of his origins and information on his career, we have to jump to the end of his life and look at archival material from Lisbon. The last 2 lines on the right-hand document on the screen here are the most important in relation to Dugood's connections in Rome and how he came to be there. This is the same Dugood, it reads, who was in Rome and had una piazza di cavalleggero from Don Carlo Albani, and who was taken by Alessandro Guzman into Portugal. On the left, the document includes his family, birthplace, and date of birth, 6th of June, 1686. Dugood's father's family were landed gentry from Banffshire, which is northeast Scotland, and were staunch Jacobites. A cousin of his, Joseph Dugood, was a Jesuit in Rome in the 1730s. His mother was a baird, Catholics and Jacobites at Orkmedan, not far from the estate of the Dugood family. In this photograph, we can see the result, the seriousness of the effects of the repression by the British government on the Jacobite supporting families in the wake of the bloody Battle of Culloden. During the War of Spanish Succession from 1702 to 1713 and fought between Holland, France, England, and the Empire, action took place mostly on battlefields in Holland. King James III, the Old Pretender, campaigned on behalf of his host at the time, Louis XIV. Also, there were many Jacobites in the so-called Scots Brigade as mercenaries, and when the war ended, these soldiers found themselves on the continent of Europe and without any means of support. The enigmatic, to me, phrase, una piazza di cavalleggero, needed some elucidation, and the Albani archives online have helped me and provided some answers. It essentially meant a position, a job, as serving officer in a noble, or in this case, the papal household, or under its protection. Here we have William Mildmay and John Rimare, both Catholic soldiers, having served in Holland, as they say in these letters, asking for cavalry positions from the Pope. Mildmay says he can't go back because of religious persecution. Rimare asks for a better position so he could support his wife in a home of their own. So it would be in a similar way, therefore, that Dugood had been employed by Don Carlo Albani, Principe di Soriano, the brother of Alessandro and Annibale Albani. They were the 3 papal nephews. We may assume that Dugood was, like these 2 men, a soldier until the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, and then he made his way to Rome, as did many other men who were also, in a sense, refugees from Protestant Britain. This had been the case ever since the removal of Catholic King James II from the throne in 1686. We should note that the Pretender himself did not settle in Italy until 1717, but was on the move before, as King Louis found his presence with the court at Saint-Germain-en-Laye disruptive to his political goals. So here we have John Alexander, who arrived in 1714 in Rome, studied painting in the studio of Chiari, as did William Kent. At this time, he painted a portrait of Thomas Cook, And in 1718, he was working as copyist and agent for the Earl of Mar, Secretary of State with the Jacobite court at Urbino, at the same time as Dugood, as we shall see. And also Andrew Hay, I have no picture of him. He was more of a dealer, was the more travelled of the two, back and forth also to France, and his clan were noted Jacobites. Crucially, both of these men were in Rome when Dr. Hobart was travelling with Lord Cornbury, and they went on to work for Thomas Cook and Hobart after their arrival in 1714. There is a veritable court of artists and agents of artists around Cook at this time, his great wealth, of course, being the draw, and his tutor's ambitions for the formation of a notable collection to display his pupils' erudition. Edward Jarrett of the household kept meticulous accounts, and these reveal not only Cook's movements around Italy, the things he bought down to the last penny, but the network of associations that made his collecting possible. And here are two references from the accounts to Alexander and to Hay. These two characters clearly fit the pattern that becomes common later in the century of men arriving as artists and then becoming dealers. William Kent appears multiple times in these accounts. There are some drawings by him in the Holcombe collection, but it was as a dealer and entrepreneur that he became most involved. And Dugood was clearly brought in to serve the household via his bonds of nationality, faith, and allegiance with the two expatriate Scotsmen we have just met. There are many mentions of Dugood, always misspelt, including lists of the prints which he supplied. So on the left, we see Kent painted by William Aikman after his return to London in the 1720s and portrayed as a painter, as he was in Rome. And a key component of his Roman career success was this image on the right, a prize-winning entry in the Concorso Clementino of 1713. However, it would appear that it was networks and politics, along with and perhaps more than his prowess as a draftsman, that led to the awarding of this distinction, as we learn from this, a letter from Father Rester, the Oratorian priest and famous connoisseur of drawings, that reveals the background to the choice of Kent as prize winner. Italy needs foreigners like him, and the glory of Rome is to show charity and justice towards all foreigners. Such an approbation from Rester would have boosted Kent's chances enormously. Rester's vast collection, by the way, was sold in various stages and mostly ended in England between 1711 and 14. He would have known Kent because John Talman was drawing the contents of the sacristy at the Chiesa Nuova during his stay in Rome, recording the precious liturgical objects and vestments there. And here are two last examples of dealing by Kent and Dugood for Thomas Cook, both still at Holcombe. First, this Francesco Bartoli drawing, one of a set of Francesco Bartoli and Pietro Santi Bartoli drawings after the antique, published by Thomas Ashby, director of the BSR, in 1919. And you can see the reference to Dugood below. And lastly, this acquisition, the famous Diana of Holcombe, bought for 900 scudi by Cook via Kent. They tried to remove this from papal territory illegally, and it was impounded at Leghorn. And Alessandro Albani wrote, "È stato trafugato non so come una statua per mandare in Inghilterra." Alessandro was certainly keen to keep the statue in Rome and available for his own burgeoning collection. The discovery of this export effort led to a brief but intense correspondence in which William Kent played a large part at resolving the problem in discussion with Alessandro Albani. Happily for Cook, it was resolved. There's a marked contrast here with the methods of Albani later in the century, by the way, when he would happily help British collectors evade the export ban. But then he was not papal nephew, so was more of a free agent. We can note the coincidence with this Diana export event and Dugood's journey to the head of the river, Fiumicino, where goods were offloaded from riverboats onto vessels heading north to Leghorn, Livorno, for which he received not payment nor expenses, but a present, suggesting that he was privy to some of the secret, perhaps secretive exporting of Cook's purchases. All our major actors are now in position, and we can look at the event that brings them together in what is surely one of the most unusual sets of circumstances for the commission of a church ceiling in Rome. As I've mentioned, apart from his mentoring of Cook and his dealing, Kent was a pupil in the studio of Chiari, the Pope's preferred artist, and he would have assisted his master on site at San Clemente in producing the elegant and lively composition that we see on the left of the screen. This is the ceiling of the nave of the Church of San Clemente. And on the right, we can see how closely Chiari is referring back to his master Maratti in this piece of work. Soon Kent was to have an opportunity to practice his newly learned skill. Kent's letter to Massingberd, which I quote on the left and at the top of the screen, mentioning the commission, does indeed make the point. Why? Why should Kent, a mere student and a Protestant artist, get this job? Well, in a way, the answer is quite banal. Dugood had been a tenant of the San Giuliano Foundation since 1716. He rented an upper apartment in the building adjacent to the church. In the center is the photograph. You can just see the entrance to the church, and the building beside is the hostel, the apartments belonging to the foundation. He rented an upper apartment there and undertook to pay 300 scudi to the foundation, which would allow them to extend into the area adjacent to the cortile behind the church. Therefore, his own apartment could be extended and he would be able to sublet to others. In return, the foundation would give him his apartment rent-free for life, as long as he found a painter for the newly refurbished church vault. As he knew Kent by then for around 4 years, and knowing that he'd won that prize for drawing, and being inexperienced would do it for next to nothing, he decided to choose him. The contract, bottom right on the screen, was signed in April 1718, after the work was completed. At that point, Dugood was just about to be employed at the Stuart court. Perhaps that large sum of money was advanced by them, the 300 scudi, or perhaps it came through his dealing for Cook, saving up his presence. We don't know. There is no evidence for this so far. Names that appear in other archival documents relating to rentals and repairs of the Duguid apartments include a certain Francesco Bianchi, of whom I can find no trace, but a statement by Dugood about his career written at the end of his life, that I'll call for convenience the Nolly map account, which I will make clear later, mentions Alexandre de Gusmão, excuse my pronunciation, Portuguese diplomat, referred to in the document I showed earlier, saying that this man had lived at his house, his Dugood's house in Rome. So here is an image of Gusmão, a Brazilian postage stamp. Brilliant diplomat, born in Santos in Brazil, who'd studied at Paris, negotiated on behalf of the King of Portugal at the Congress of Cambrai, was in Rome from 1721 to 28, and was a patron of the arts. In Rome, as an honorary member of the Accademia di San Luca, he is known to have bought at least one painting, which he sent to John V of Portugal. There was a highly organized policy of artistic acquisition being undertaken on behalf of the Portuguese monarch at the time. Having this Portuguese connection through his tenant would be useful and significant for Dugood. Here is what Kent produced, as we've seen, with a charming preparatory drawing at the top of the screen. We can see the close adherence to the model of Chiari in what Kent painted. So his painting of this, his connection with Talman and the famous Father Resta, and of course the Richards, Croesus, Thomas Cook, would have assured interest amongst visitors, travelers, as well as the local virtuosi in this project, as we can see from the comment in his letter that he invited people up to view him on the scaffolding as he was painting. It was significant for him to have this commission as a showcase as an upcoming artist in 18th century Rome, perhaps explaining why he was content to eventually receive only a present of 50 scudi from the foundation, as documents in the archive reveal. There are 4 pendentives to this vault paintings, but they are on canvas and they're not by Kent. Kent and Cook formed the largely legitimate and respectable face of Dugood's activities in the market, and we can now examine the remainder of his artistic and dealing career. He entered into the world of the newly established court of James III at Urbino when he was recommended by Francis Panton, travel companion of Lord Linton, in Rome from May that year, both of them Jacobites. In August 1718, a warrant was issued appointing Dugood as jeweller to the court. This implies that as well as his dealing activities since his arrival in Rome, he must have been working as a gold, silver, and gem artist and artisan at the time. Perhaps he had provided some items for Linton. Certainly he would have met him due to his connection with the Jacobite artists Hay and Alexander while working for Hobart and Cook. Stosh, who we see in the centre there in a beautiful medal from 1720, had arrived, as we've heard, from Holland in 1715. He was a Protestant and always remained so, and was recruited in 1721 by the British government to spy on the Jacobite court that had recently changed location from Urbino to Rome. He then in turn recruited Dugood. The exact circumstances of this are not revealed by his letters, but the interconnecting networks I've outlined already indicate there are several ways in which they may have met. And as is perennially the case with spies, as it was with Stosh, often writing to the government in Britain for more money in order to pay his spies and other expenses, probably Dugood needed money. And no doubt his work with the highly respectable Protestant Thomas Cook would have provided bona fides for the British government. The Jacobites in Rome were nothing if not paranoid, and of course had spies of their own. In 1722, in November, Dugood was arrested and thrown into the prison of the Inquisition for supposed heresy, but actually because the Jacobite court suspected their official jeweller of informing on the movements and meetings at Palazzo Muti. After Stosh appealed to Alessandro Albani, Dugood was released on grounds of religious tolerance. Stosh presents him to his paymasters in London as a poor benighted Protestant harassed by dastardly Jacobites, and Dugood left Rome for England, where his new identity as a Protestant government servant would have eased his passage. And so at the bottom here we have some examples of letters from Stosh to the British government. On the left-hand side, John Walton, that's his alias, and on the right you can see him mentioning Dugood's name. His letters were all written in French and some in code. Dugood in London reveals a man making his way in business, in society, and in his professional interests, as these two newspaper cuttings reveal. He joined the Freemasons, was active as a diamond merchant, and doubtless as a result of his Freemasonic connections, as well as his expertise in stones and mineralogy, was elected as a member of the most prestigious club in England at a time when enlightened sociability was embracing antiquarian interests, as we saw with Talman and the recently founded Society of Antiquaries, and later on in the century, travel and connoisseurship with the Society of Dilettanti. Freemasonry was the background to acceptability in all of these contexts. It should be noted that it was not until 1738 with the papal bull In Eminenti, promulgated by Clement XII, that Catholics were forbidden from joining the Freemasons. And the Pope did that under pressure from James III in concern about political activity in the Florence and Paris lodges. Dugood's scientific credentials were solid, as is proven by this marvelous object which he created, the mounted lodestone, a large piece of magnetite mounted into a ducal coronet. And this apparatus was demonstrated a few years later at a meeting at the Royal Society, as the quotation at the bottom tells you. However, by then, Dugood was on the move again, first to Lisbon, where established alliances based on the wine trade made a lucrative market for Britons. This must have tempted him, but no doubt his connection with Gushmao from Rome would have assisted. Or perhaps he was on a mission from the Freemasons, as it appears that he founded the first unofficial Freemasonic lodge in Portugal in 1728. After Lisbon, it was back to Italy in 1731. In the Nolli map account, he states that he was at Naples and then travelled to Parma, where he undertook a project that provides us with the most concrete evidence of his artistic production. So here on the left, we have the Dowager Duchess of Parma, de facto ruler of Parma at the time, standing in as regent for her grandson, the young Duke Charles, later Charles III of Spain. Having been recommended to the court at Parma to appraise the jewels of the Farnese family, which had arrived at that court through inheritance, Dugood was allowed to make cast copies of the magnificent collection of gems, intaglios, and coins, which was a considerable task, and which led him to being highly recommended by the Duchess, as the letter on the right-hand side shows, a letter to Maria Clementina, wife of James III. And now we can take a look at what he produced when he was at Parma. I show some of the most important objects. The treasures are, of course, now with the Farnese collection in the Naples Archaeological Museum, and special thanks to David Connell for the photography of the casts. The cast collection is fascinating, particularly its provenance. And as these images will show, it provides key information about the state and content of the Farnese collection in the 1730s. So this magnificent object is the Cassetta Farnese, a Renaissance casket with inset carved crystal plaquettes, and there are 6 of them. And we see the casts that Dugood made of 2. On the left, the Triumph of Bacchus. This is based on a design by Perin del Vaga, and a Naumachia on the right-hand side. So obviously in the Farnese collection is the most spectacular ancient object, the Tazza Farnese. And we can see here that Dugood made a sulfur cast from the Tazza on the left. Apparently sulfur gave better detail than plaster, and made also a papier-mâché model, which he painted, which you see on the right. Here is the famous Marcus Curtius agate cameo with Dugood sulfur cast. That shows how it was in 1731. And in fact, the Renaissance frame is now missing, so it's a valuable piece of evidence. And in the center there is a tray from the cabinet itself, so you can see how the casts were presented and viewed by collectors. And recently I found out that there is a 17th century version of this gem, a copy of it, from the Strozzi, originally from the Strozzi collection, is now in the British Museum. So this was a very famous gem, copied as well as being available for casts. And finally, Dugood's sulfur cast of the Farnese hippocamp. The original has been lost from the collection since Dugood's time, so the cast is an all-important record. And this gem was very famous and was published in Stosch's illustrated treatise of 70 ancient gems in 1724. The presence of a cabinet of casts, if not of gems themselves, was a sine qua non of the educated collector in Europe from the Renaissance onwards, and there was a considerable industry in their production in Rome and elsewhere. The study of gems furnished scholars with a whole iconography of the antique. Cast collections were an encyclopedia for connoisseurs, and Dugood must have had this in mind when creating his, in the hope of being able to interest a buyer from amongst the English grand tourists in Italy. But in fact, he was obliged to leave Italy, and it was only at the end of his life that the work that he'd done in Parma in the 30s came onto the market, to end up in Yorkshire, top left, courtesy of the sale in 1760 to Sir William Constable. These casts or impressions of gems and intaglios are as in sealing wax, plaster, and sulfur, as I mentioned. In the pictures, the lower of the 2 cabinets shown here also contains lead alloy impressions taken from the collection of medals and their trays containing casts of Greek and Roman coins. Amongst the items included in the shipment to Constable were rock samples indicating that Dugood was collecting minerals in Italy. And we see top right a manuscript which was included regarding the collection of coins, naming the doctor and the Freemason Antonio Cocchi, who we will meet again in a moment. By now, both the Hanoverians and Jacobites were aware of and uneasy about Dugood's presence, and the latter put pressure on the court in Parma to dismiss him, and so he moved to nearby Florence, where the Freemasonic lodge and proximity of his old friend Stosch, himself now an exile from Rome because of his espionage activities, became a natural home for him. Soon Dugood ran into trouble again. He was becoming persona non grata. In September 1733, he was arrested in Florence by Jacobite agents, but was released 10 days later as a result of an intervention from Stosch again. And we see here Stosch in his Florentine days in that wonderful caricature. The Baron, who famously described gems as his folie dominante, had by then published his book Gemmae Antiquae and was amassing his own vast collection of gems, around 4,000 pieces, which was the collection examined incidentally by Winkelmann and is now in Berlin. Dugood's Freemasonic connections and the relative prestige of Stosch at the Florentine Grand Ducal Court of Giangastoni dei Medici helped to extricate him from this latest difficulty. The Florence Lodge was a gathering place of men of many backgrounds and broke down national societal barriers. We have evidence of an early meeting of the lodge in the diary of Antonio Cocchi, shown at the top, obviously translated. This meeting did not include Dugood, but he must have attended a later one on the following year, as we have evidence that in November 33, just after his release from prison, he journeyed to Rome in the company of some notable grand tourists who were also Freemasons. Hugh Smithson, shown on the right, soon to become the vastly wealthy Duke of Northumberland, equal in wealth to Dugood's early employer, Thomas Cook, and his tutor, the Reverend Benjamin Crowe, who was, and this will not be a surprise, an expert in gems and intaglios. There was then a dinner on the 12th of November at the house in Rome of William Holbeck with Crowe, Smithson, and Dugood's friend Martin Folks of the Royal Society. It's probable that Dugood would have been of the party, and Folks's diary is at the Bodleian, which I haven't yet managed to see. But it was surely a mistake for Dugood to go to Rome. The Jacobites were still anxious to find cause to imprison him, and perhaps Cardinal Albani was wary of bailing him out. So, courtesy of the British in their warship Dolphin, and under the patronage of Gushmao, as we have seen, he finally left Italy and went to live in Lisbon with his family in 1734. Although the British were hoping he would eventually settle in London so they could milk him for information, it appears he did not. It is time to sum up. Dugood's Italian career was over. In Lisbon, he flourished as a silversmith, writing this dissertation on magnetism as well, based on his research, and mounted another lodestone here on the right. He was clearly well connected at the court and amongst academic circles, as well as with both Italian and British expatriate communities. For example, the sculptor Alessandro Tanzi came from Italy to live in Lisbon with Dugood and died at his house. He was known to be a Freemason, of course. After the cataclysmic 1755 earthquake, it is known that Dugood was employed at reconstructing silver vessels belonging to the church and the court that had been destroyed. But it was not only his cast collection and mineral samples that he brought with him from Italy. It appears that that warship must have been heavily laden, since to my surprise, I discovered that Dugood had sold to the King of Portugal a huge collection of prints and books made during his time in Rome. His bookplate appears on the right with his family crest. So it would seem that his skill in sourcing items for Thomas Cook's print collection enabled him to create a notable one of his own. In fact, his collection forms the major part of the Brazilian national collection kept in the National Library at Rio de Janeiro, brought there for safekeeping when the imminent Napoleonic aggression sent the whole Portuguese court to refuge in Brazil in 1807. A manuscript letter in the archive there, of which I have not yet managed to see the transcription, written by Dugood in Lisbon to King Jose I of Portugal, explains that he is a member of the Royal Society of London and was instructed by them to gather on their behalf a collection of prints from old masters, les plus anciens et célèbres peintres. He adds that he was on the point of sending this collection of his to London when, knowing that the king was organizing his library, and this is presumably in the light of the destruction and losses sustained after the earthquake of 1755, he proposed to the king this collection, offering him at the same time groups of bound prints and volumes of art from the 16th century to the present time, which was around 1760 he was writing this, when he was also looking for a buyer for his cast collection. And on the back of the Nolly map, which I show obviously on the screen, which was part of the print collection, is the biographical note, which along with the documents in the archive at San Giuliano helped me to piece together the jigsaw puzzle of his life and career. So, in homage to all the digital humanities experts, especially my friend and colleague Jason Kelly, I made this network map, which is, unlike his work, entirely unscientific, but it does give an idea, albeit a confused one perhaps, of the multiplicity of activities and connections surrounding Kent and Dugood. So these are the various codes of the various different types of activity, and cursive font is Catholic, plain font is Protestant. I think we can learn a lot about the market for drawings, for gems and casts, for books and prints via this Kent and Dugood story. And not only that, also about commissioning of church paintings, about the democratization of collecting, that there were networks within networks. And I think that's something that this plan can show, if nothing else. That religion and affiliation were not barriers where connoisseurship, learning, and the market acted as triple parallel stimuli. The ability of Dugood to reinvent himself, to create personal networks based on the more notable, more wealthy or established people around him, the noble Protestant grand tourists, ambitious artists with supportive patrons, Kent, for example, the Jacobite and other courts, cardinals, mixing with philosophers and scientists and Freemasons, all this indicative of a bottom-up energy driving the market. We see him using his Freemasonry, for example, like a passport to get him from one network to another, shedding aspects of his identity along the way, taking up others, all in order to facilitate his career and, as a spy, or former spy, living a very precarious existence, right up until his departure for Lisbon. Yet throughout he was dealing, building up his own collection and continuing to practice his art. And at the end of his life, respectability arrived by selling his collection into royal hands, probably to ensure the well-being of his family after his death. Luckily for England, although the Royal Society did not get his magnificent print collection, we do have the objects in the Burton Constable cast collection that have helped me to tell this story. Thank you very much.